Let me move now to the applied evidence. This is the second section of this talk. So conclusion number one is that even though Africa is commonly viewed as a land-abundant country, the remaining arable land is highly concentrated both within countries and between countries. So take a look at this table here that shows in the first column the millions of hectares that are considered to be still available for conversion into farmland. It's not including forest land. And then the proportions of land in the entire continent. So you can see that DRC Congo, one country all by itself, accounts for almost half of all of the unutilized land remaining in the region. And by the time you get through DRC Congo, Angola, the Republic of the Congo, and Zambia, now you're at 70% of all of the unutilized land. There are 9 countries, the ones listed here, that account for over 90% of all of the unutilized, non-forested arable land remaining in the region. So as we all know, there are about 54 countries in Africa. So that means that the other 10% of the remaining arable land are concentrated or dispersed, I should say, across 45 sub-Saharan African countries, including the most populous ones, Nigeria, Ethiopia, Uganda, Kenya. You know, right there, I think we've accounted for roughly 50 or 60% of Africa's population, and rural population, excuse me. And there are severe land constraints emerging in those areas. And as I said before, as population growth is occurring, rural population growth, the demand for that land is going to become more acute with time. Here's a map of Zambia, one of the most sparsely populated countries in Africa. And you can see that along the line of rail here, the red shows where rural populations are concentrated. So even though the country as a whole has a lot of unexploited arable land, where the people are living, actually, where the infrastructure is, where the roads, where the schools, where the communities are, these areas are getting quite heavily populated, and land constraints are starting to emerge even in a country like Zambia. Now at the other extreme here in Kenya, you have severe land constraints out in the western part of that country. Those are rural areas there, but very highly populated. Some areas of rural Kenya are now more populated than Nairobi was in 1985. So these rural areas are slowly being converted into, you know, almost rural slums is what people call them in Kenya. Land is very, very hard to come by, and of course this is causing outmigration into the urban areas. So there's a relationship between land constraints in rural areas and outmigration to urban and other rural areas. This graph here is one that I consider extremely important for understanding the distributional effects of agricultural growth. Zambia is a country that's achieved fairly rapid rates of agricultural growth over the last 10 years. And if you were to disaggregate this crop sales revenue by farm size, as is done here, you would see that about 9% of the farm population is accounting for the lion's share of that agricultural growth. And if you look at the smaller sizes of farms, those between 0 and let's say 2 hectares, which account for 75% of all of the farms in Zambia, you can see pretty much flat-lined. So they're not enjoying the benefits of that growth, and their farm sizes are one of the factors that constrains their ability to start participating in these growth processes. So it's a very skewed form of agricultural growth, and one that we need to really take account of when we hear stories about rapid agricultural growth in Africa over the last decade. We have to ask ourselves what percentage of the rural population are participating in that growth, and are the others, the remainder of the rural population, are they somehow benefiting indirectly from the growth that's occurring on a small number of farms, or are they being more marginalized through the process? And then what does that have to do with land policy and the way that land is being allocated within Zambia and in these other countries? A second conclusion is that there is obviously rising interest in Africa's arable land by global and domestic investors. So ever since 2007, 2008, with the rise in global food prices, this has not only, this has created great interest in acquiring arable land in Africa, which by the World Bank's estimates contains about 55 to 60% of the world's remaining arable land. This graph shows large-scale farmland acquisitions by country over the past 7 or 8 year period from 2005 to 2012. The countries on the right, Mozambique, Zambia, Ethiopia, and Ghana, are the ones that have received the greatest interest and the ones that have allocated the most land to large-scale, both foreign and domestic investors. This graph comes from Schoneveld in a food policy article from 2014. Now, over the 7-year period, these large-scale acquisitions, just in the 7-year period, account for roughly 9 or 10% of all of the cropped area currently in sub-Saharan Africa. So it's not a marginal addition to cropland, roughly 9 to 10% of total area cultivated. So our conclusion, number 2, is that there is rapid increase in farmland acquisitions by large-scale entities, and we need to carefully trace through the effects that it's having. Now, under the radar screen is an even more rapid increase in farmland acquisitions by domestic investors. And these are called, in some places, medium-scale farms or emergent farms. They tend to be urban-based professionals, many government employees, who are also kind of cashing in on the higher value of land that's been driven by higher world food prices. So in many of the countries that we've looked at, this medium-scale farm sector is expanding in a meteoric way. Here's Zambia once again. Each year, the government of Zambia implements these large-scale surveys that allow us to kind of analyze trends over time. So if you look at this graph in 2001, this shows the number of farms that were existing in Zambia, disaggregated by farm size here. And if take the 0 to 2 hectare group, it increased from 638,000 farms in 2001 to 748,000 farms about a decade later. So that's a 17% rise over that 10 or 11 year period. But if you contrast that with farms between 10 and 20 hectares, they rose from roughly 2,000 farms in 2001 to 53,000 farms in 2012. So that's, a huge multiple increase. And then farms between 20 and 100 hectares, well, they weren't even recorded in 2001, but now there's already 14,000 of them by 2012. So they're also rising at a rapid pace. The Zambian government doesn't record changes in farms over 100 hectares, but from anecdotal evidence, we believe that that is rising very rapidly as well. So now let's look at the red box here. And this shows that by 2012, if you just add up these 3 numbers here, you'll see that there's more farmland in Zambia under the control of farms between 5 and 100 hectares, 52%. They even they have more land than small-scale farming now. And this is something new. This was not the case 10 or 20 years ago. If we were to factor in farms that were over 100 hectares, certainly the percentage of land in the hands of medium and large-scale farms would be even higher. So this underestimates actually the true extent to which medium and large-scale farms are starting to dominate. And then the other concerning factor on the last column of data here, this shows the share of land owned that's actually cultivated. So farms between 0 and 2 hectares are cultivating over 90% of their land that's in their control. But that decreases progressively as farm size increases, to the point where only about 11% of farmland between 20 and 100 hectares is actually being cultivated. Okay, so who are these emergent farmers? We've actually gone in 3 countries to go and interview them and ask them about how they acquired their land, what their primary source of employment was, and so forth. So in Kenya and Zambia, we find that the majority of them are urban-based, as I said before. They're primary salaried employees. Many of them are in the public sector. They have relatively high levels of education. They are mostly men. And in central and northern Ghana, this was sort of the outlier. Most there started out as small-scale farmers, then scaled up. So a much more positive story if you're looking for cases where smallholders were able to kind of break out of the shackles of poverty and acquire more land and become, emergent medium-scale farmers. Northern Ghana is a fairly land-abundant place. The chiefs and traditional authorities are the ones who allocate land in that area. So we're trying to replicate this study in a much a broader number of countries. The data from Malawi looks more like Kenya and Zambia, kind of an urban-based acquisition of farmland there. Okay, the fourth conclusion is that, as you would imagine from the data that I've presented so far, that there's a rising concentration of land holdings. And if you were to use the Gini coefficient as your measure of sort of land inequality, you see in each one of these countries, using nationally representative survey data, that the Gini coefficients are increasing over time, which means land is becoming more concentrated in a relatively smaller number of hands. To put these numbers in context, if you were to compare them with like India or Bangladesh, their Gini coefficients are about 0.3, 0.35 maybe. If you were to compare them with Guatemala or other parts of Latin America, they're up in the 0.8 to 0.9 range. So we're somewhere in between those two, but the movement is in the direction of the South American status. Conclusion number 5 is that land controlled by medium-scale farms exceeds that of even large-scale farms. So here are the numbers on this. In Ghana, more land is being controlled now by medium-scale farms, and the rate of increase is more rapid in medium-scale farms too. Same thing with Kenya and in Zambia. So while the international media has focused most of its attention on foreign direct investment in land, and it certainly is a major issue to keep track of, we think that tracking the medium-scale farms and what kind of impact they're having on food security, employment, and other national policy goals is equally, if not more important, than the large scale.